Is catastrophe brewing for Gaza, Ukraine, and beyond? Please be aware that all my podcasts are based on internet research, history, the Bible, the Quran, and current events. I am not a journalist or business, but rather a content creator. Welcome to my podcast, Global Flashpoints. In this show, we delve deep into the most pressing global issues. I am your host, Daniel, and today we are tackling an urgent question. Are the escalating crises in Gaza, Ukraine, and beyond pushing us toward catastrophe? Or is there still a path to peace? Stick with us as we break it all down. I have always believed there are three sides to every story or truth. This podcast will attempt to clarify, or at least help you understand, all viewpoints from everyone's perspective. By that, I mean government, citizens, and outsiders looking in. Only the people living through it know what is happening. Remember, the visitors write history, the losers are wiped from the history books. Is global chaos on the horizon? From the ongoing conflict in Gaza to the escalating tensions in Ukraine, it's clear that the world is at a critical juncture. Join us as we examine the latest developments in these regions and explore the potential implications for global stability. Will we see a surge in violence and unrest, or can diplomacy and cooperation prevail? Tune in for a thought-provoking analysis of the current state of affairs and what it might mean for our collective future. Join me as I dive into the complex situation unfolding in Gaza, Ukraine, and beyond, and challenge myself to make sense of the chaos and what it means for our future. The world is witnessing two major crises unfolding in Gaza and Ukraine, and it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of human suffering and geopolitical tensions at play. From the devastating airstrikes in Gaza to the escalating conflict in eastern Ukraine, it's clear that these crises are far from being resolved anytime soon. In fact, they're increasingly interconnected, with global implications that threaten international security and stability. As we try to make sense of these complex issues, it's essential to recognize that both Gaza and Ukraine are sitting on a powder keg of historical, political, and social tensions. The roots of these conflicts run deep, and understanding their evolution is crucial to grasping their current trajectory. In this documentary, we'll delve into the heart of these crises, exploring the human impact, the geopolitical implications, and the glimmer of hope for peace and recovery. The situation in Gaza is a stark reminder of the cyclical nature of violence and conflict. For decades, the Strip has been plagued by Israeli military operations, Hamas rockets, and a crippling blockade that has pushed its population to the brink of humanitarian disaster. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been embroiled in a devastating conflict that has pitted Russian-backed separatists against the Ukrainian army, leaving millions displaced, injured, or dead. As the crises escalate, it's becoming increasingly clear that their repercussions will be felt far beyond their borders. Historically, Gaza has been a flashpoint for regional and global tensions. From the creation of Israel in 1948 to the current blockade, the Strip has been a symbol of Palestinian displacement and resistance. The 2007 takeover by Hamas marked a significant escalation, as Israel responded with strict border controls, crippling the economy and trapping its population in a cycle of poverty and despair. Ukraine's conflict, meanwhile, has its roots in the 2014 Euromaidan protests, which ousted Viktor Yanukovych and sparked Russian annexation of Crimea. The ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine has been fueled by Russian support for separatist groups, which has drawn international condemnation and sanctions. Despite multiple ceasefire agreements, the violence has continued to simmer, with devastating consequences for civilians caught in the crossfire. In recent months, the situation in both regions has deteriorated rapidly. In Gaza, a series of Israeli airstrikes has killed dozens of Palestinians, while Hamas has responded with rockets that have sent Israeli civilians fleeing for cover. The escalation has sparked widespread international condemnation, with the United Nations warning of an imminent humanitarian catastrophe. In Ukraine, the conflict has entered a new phase, with the Ukrainian army launching a major offensive to retake separatist-held territories. the fighting has been intense with reports of heavy shelling, civilian casualties, and widespread destruction. As the conflict drags on, it's clear that the human toll is staggering, with millions forced to flee their homes and entire cities reduced to rubble. Behind the headlines, there are countless stories of human suffering, of families torn apart, of children orphaned, and of communities shattered. In Gaza, the humanitarian crisis is worsening by the day, with hospitals overwhelmed and medical supplies running low. In Ukraine, the conflict has destroyed entire towns, leaving survivors to pick up the pieces and rebuild their shattered lives. Because Prime Minister Netanyahu refused to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, many children died of starvation, while their mothers and siblings held them in their arms to comfort their last days of their shortened life on this planet. Many adults, especially seniors, also died due to starvation. Prime Minister Netanyahu says their goal is to wipe Hamas from the face of the earth. In his efforts to achieve his goal, it is the innocent children, infants, disabled citizens, and the elderly he is killing off. Hamas has not been weakened. If anything, his inhumane treatment of the civilians has only proven to increase Hamas's power in Gaza. Now, after 15 months, Netanyahu is allowing humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. In Ukraine, it is more a question of Putin violating the rules of the Geneva Convention and his violation of the laws of war. He is targeting schools, hospitals, apartment complexes, and more with no regard for the citizens who may be in these buildings. He is stealing their infants and young children and sending them to Russia. Putin and Netanyahu are fighting these wars with complete immunity for all the war violations. All they get is a slap on the wrist and someone somewhere saying, "Don't do that again." Why do we have the United Nations, European Union, and NATO? Ukraine has the humanitarian aid and can also supply most of its people's needs. The political and social challenges facing both regions are daunting. In Gaza, the blockade has crippled the economy, and Hamas's rule and Netanyahu's war has been marked by human rights abuses and political repression. In Ukraine, the conflict has exacerbated existing fault lines, pitting Ukrainian nationalists against Russian-speaking separatists and fueling a toxic mix of nationalism and xenophobia. Russia is now eyeing the Scandinavian and Baltic regions. Someone needs to stop him. On the other hand, if you believe in God, Allah, Yahweh, you know God's plan is coming to fruition. There is no stopping any of these events. In Gaza, we have the Israelites who are determined to wipe Hamas off the face of the earth. In the words of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the war against Hamas would continue until all of Israel's objectives are achieved, including the elimination of Hamas as a governing and military entity. One just needs to watch the video news footage coming out of Gaza to realize that Israel is nowhere near that claim. Hamas is still as strong and respected by the Palestinian people as they were before the war. Leaders can be replaced, so when Israel kills one leader, there are several in line to take their places. When we look at the Ukraine-Russia war, this is not close to ending. The president campaigned on the promise to bring this war to an end on day one of his presidency. Without some strong arming on his part on Russia and many unwanted concessions on both sides, this war is destined to drag on. President Trump said he would not turn his back on Ukraine, but he has already ended all their military aid from the United States. And we were giving them as much aid as all of Europe combined. I know it seems unfair, but without the United States, the free world will fall. That is why our president is called the leader of the free world. We are the beacon of hope for all free nations, even if many will not admit it. Without us, Europe would fall within a few years. Even with all the aid we have sent to Ukraine, we still have the largest, most powerful military machine in the world. Today, we are going beyond the headlines. We will explore the history, the current realities, and the potential outcomes of these major global flashpoints. So grab a seat and let's get into it. As the world grapples with these complex issues, it's clear that resolving them will require a sustained effort from local and international communities. In Gaza, there are growing calls for a lifting of the blockade, coupled with genuine Palestinian statehood. In Ukraine, a lasting ceasefire and meaningful political reforms are essential to ending the violence and rebuilding the country. Despite the bleakness of the situation, there are glimmers of hope. In Gaza, humanitarian organizations are working tirelessly to provide aid, and diplomats are pushing for a new round of peace talks. In Ukraine, local ceasefires have held, and there are signs of a growing grassroots movement for peace and reconciliation. As we conclude this documentary, it's essential to recognize that the crises in Gaza and Ukraine are far from being isolated events. They're symptoms of a deeper malaise, one that demands a fundamental rethinking of our global priorities, from conflict resolution to humanitarian aid and from human rights to international cooperation. The stakes are high, but it's not too late to make a difference. Join me in demanding more from our leaders and in pushing for a world that's more just, more compassionate, and more at peace. Now let's shift to Ukraine. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, the world watched in shock. Thousands of lives lost, entire cities in ruins, and millions forced to flee their homes. NATO's involvement, Russia's ambitions, and Ukraine's resilience have kept this war at the forefront of global discussions. Many people are under the illusion that the Ukraine-Russo war began with the full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022. This conception, however, is false. The war began back in February 2014 when disguised Russian troops covertly invaded and took control of the Ukrainian Autonomous Republic of Crimea. In the following months, Russian troops took control of areas in the Donbas region, resulting in the death of over 14,000 people prior to the full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022. With the invasion in 2022, Russia has demonstrated that they are willing to play the long game to reunite the old Soviet Union. Russia is also good at the fake news about the war. Russia is losing the war in the short plan. However, in the long game, Russia has the weapons and military soldiers to outlast Ukraine unless NATO puts boots on the ground or increases the quantity and speed at which they resupply Ukraine. Now that Putin has the North Koreans to feed the meat grinder that will help spare the lives of Russian soldiers and ease the resentment of the Russian people against the war. Ukraine has many things working in their favor now. They have the advantage in a drone war. I heard on the news the other day that Ukraine now has their own weapons factories operating, so all they need is money to keep their supplies coming. South Korea would be willing to sell a lot to Ukraine through a third party. South Korea cannot sell directly to a nation who is actively involved in a war with another nation. However, this does not prevent sale to a nation who is at peace. Then it is no longer South Korea who decides what the buyer does with the equipment. Let's break down what's happening on the ground in Gaza right now. Recent developments, increased airstrikes, militant attacks, and mounting casualties. Humanitarian impact, thousands of civilians displaced, critical shortages of food and medicine, and a worsening humanitarian crisis. Political landscape, Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, each playing a key role in how the conflict unfolds. International response, the UN, global leaders, and nations around the world, some calling for peace, others taking sides. Thanks to the ongoing efforts of the United States and Qatar, a ceasefire began about a week ago. Several hostages have been released. Another 3 hostages should be released on Saturday, February 1st, 2025. Regretfully and with great sorrow, I should also include... Now let's shift to Ukraine. Where do things stand today? Recent developments, ongoing battles, shifting front lines, and the impact of Western military aid. Humanitarian impact, millions of refugees, destruction of infrastructure, and loss of civilian life. Political landscape, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the European Union, all key players influencing the war's direction. International response, sanctions, diplomatic efforts, military aid, how the world is reacting, and what it means for the future. So what does all of this mean beyond Gaza and Ukraine? Here's what's at stake. Economic impact, supply chains disrupted, rising energy prices, inflation, all affecting everyday lives across the world. Security concerns, the risk of conflict spreading, nuclear threats, and an increasingly unstable world. Diplomatic efforts, who is stepping up to mediate? Can global leaders prevent further escalation?
Hope for peace now.